Welcome, dear listeners, to another classic mystery with Hercule Poirot. Tonight we arrive at Glassmere Dock, a quiet stretch of water where fog drifts slowly, lanterns flicker against wet wood, and footsteps vanish as easily as secrets. When a lifeless body is discovered at the edge of the pier, the question is not how the man died, but how he arrived there unseen. As the tide rises and alibis drift apart, Poirot must untangle a case built on silence, timing, and a dock that remembers more than it reveals. Settle in, relax, and let your little grey cells awaken, because at Glassmere Dock, the water is calm, but the truth is not. Chapter 1. The body found at low tide. Glassmere Dock was never meant to be discovered at dawn. It was a place that belonged to fog and evening lamps, to the creak of mooring ropes and the low murmur of water against timber. By daylight it looked almost embarrassed, its damp planks exposed, its secrets laid bare beneath a pale, reluctant sky. And yet, on this particular morning, it was dawn that revealed the truth. The tide was low when the body was found. That detail would matter later. Very much later. At first it was simply a shape. Thomas Reed, a dock labourer who had worked the Glassmere waterfront for nearly 20 years, noticed it while untying a skiff near the outer pier. He had already grumbled about the cold, the mist clinging to his coat, and the inconvenience of an early start. His eyes, dulled by routine, almost passed over the dark form lying awkwardly between two pilings. Almost. It was the stillness that stopped him. Glassmere Dock was never still, not truly. Even at low tide the water shifted, the wood groaned softly, and the air carried movement. But the figure at the edge of the planks did not respond to any of it. Thomas froze. Then he shouted. Within minutes the quiet dock was broken by hurried footsteps, lantern light and sharp voices cutting through the fog. Someone ran for the constable. Another crossed himself. A third simply stared, as though staring long enough might undo what had been found. The body lay half on the dock, half toward the water, one arm dangling limply over the edge. The man's coat was soaked at the hem, but dry across the shoulders. His hat lay several feet away, resting improbably upright against a crate. No blood stained the planks, no weapon was visible, no sign of struggle marked the wood. Only the tide, low, withdrawn, almost polite, exposed the corpse for inspection. A death without witness. By the time Inspector Japp arrived, the fog had begun to thin, revealing the grey outline of Glassmere village beyond the harbour. Fishermen stood at a distance, whispering. Dock workers lingered uneasily, unsure whether they were allowed to leave. Japp crouched near the body, careful not to disturb anything. "Name?" he asked. "Harold Fenwick," replied the local constable, "shipping clerk, worked with manifests and schedules, lived in the village." Japp frowned. "Any reason he'd be here before sunrise?" The constable shook his head. "None that anyone admits." Japp straightened and surveyed the dock. "No witnesses?" he asked. "None," came the reply. "At least none who heard or saw anything." Japp muttered under his breath. "Dockside murders without witnesses. I hate them." A familiar voice answered calmly behind him. "Because docks remember things differently, mon ami." Japp turned. Hercule Poirot stood a few steps back from the body, immaculate despite the damp air. His moustache was perfectly arranged, his eyes alert and thoughtful. He had arrived quietly, without drama, as though summoned not by urgency but by inevitability. "You were nearby?" Japp asked. Poirot inclined his head. "Visiting. One does not choose when mystery chooses him." Poirot did not approach the body immediately. Instead, he walked slowly along the planks, observing the dock itself, the spacing of the boards, the height of the posts, the marks left by years of tide and rope. "The tide was low," Poirot said softly. Japp nodded. "Yes, lucky in a way. Otherwise the body might have drifted." Poirot stopped walking. "Or," he said gently, "it would not have been found here at all." To the position that raises questions, Poirot finally knelt beside the corpse. Harold Fenwick's face was pale but unmarked. His expression held neither fear nor surprise, only an odd neutrality, as though death had come during a pause rather than an interruption. Poirot studied the arm dangling over the edge. "Inspector," Poirot said quietly, "if a man falls into water at low tide, where does he land?" Japp frowned. below the dock, onto mud or rock. Poirot nodded. Exactly. Poirot gestured toward the waterline, several feet beneath the planks. And yet, Poirot continued, this man lies on the dock. Japp's eyes sharpened. You think he wasn't killed here? Poirot shook his head. I think he was placed here. Poirot examined the coat more closely. Wet below, Poirot murmured. Dry above. He straightened. Harold Fenwick entered the water, Poirot said calmly. But he did not die by falling from this height. Japp exhaled slowly. So he drowned somewhere else? Poirot smiled faintly. Or he was dead before the water touched him. At the dock that moves, Poirot stood and walked to the edge, peering down at the exposed seabed. The tide, Poirot said, is an accomplice that never speaks, but it always tells time. Japp folded his arms. Explain. At high tide, Poirot said, the water would reach the planks. A body placed here would float. It would drift. It would knock. Poirot gestured to the stillness. At low tide, the water withdraws. It reveals what was hidden. Poirot turned back toward the body. This man, Poirot said, arrived here after the tide had turned. Japp frowned. Meaning? Poirot replied softly. Meaning he did not fall in the night. A village that wakes uneasily. As the body was carefully removed, the village began to stir. Windows opened. Conversations halted mid-sentence when Poirot passed. Harold Fenwick was known. Quiet, meticulous, not the sort of man one expected to find dead on wet planks at dawn. Poirot requested a brief gathering at the harbour-master's office. Those present included Martha Fenwick, the widow, pale and composed in shock, Samuel Clark, night watchman at the dock, Edwin Moore, boat rental operator, Lydia Hart, owner of a nearby warehouse, Captain Rowley, retired mariner and regular dock presence. Poirot observed them carefully. Mesdames et messieurs, Poirot said gently, I will ask you only simple questions. He paused. Who saw Harold Fenwick last night? Captain Rowley spoke first. I did. Near dusk. He was checking papers. Lydia Hart nodded. He left my office before dark. Samuel Clark shifted. I was on watch from midnight. I saw no one. Poirot smiled faintly. That, he said softly, is interesting. The watchman's certainty, Poirot turned toward Samuel Clark. You are certain no one came onto the dock? Yes, sir. Poirot tilted his head. And you heard nothing unusual? No. Poirot nodded. Inspector, Poirot said calmly, Glassmere Dock does not permit silence. Japp frowned. What do you mean? Poirot gestured toward the planks. These boards speak. They creak. They complain. Poirot looked back at Clark. For a body to be placed here, Poirot said softly, someone walked these planks. Clark swallowed. And yet, Poirot continued, you heard nothing. Poirot straightened. Either the dock was empty, Poirot said, or the person who moved upon it was expected. A question without accusation, Poirot dismissed the group gently. He returned to the dock alone. The fog had lifted now, revealing the water in full daylight. The tide, obedient to its schedule, had begun to creep back. Poirot watched it rise. Time, Poirot murmured, always moves the truth closer. The case had only begun. The dock had shown him one thing clearly. Harold Fenwick did not die where he was found, and whoever placed him there knew exactly when the water would retreat. Chapter 2. Footsteps washed away. Glassmere Dock looked different once the sun rose fully. In the early hours, it had seemed almost theatrical, fog curling around posts, lantern light trembling on wet wood. A corpse revealed at low tide like a secret the sea had reluctantly returned. But by mid-morning the dock appeared ordinary, almost innocent. Fishermen argued over nets. A gull cried sharply overhead. The water shifted with familiar impatience against the pilings. And yet Poirot knew innocence was often just routine, uninterrupted. He returned to the dock with Inspector Japp shortly after 10. The tide had continued its slow return, covering the mud line that had been exposed at dawn. If one did not know what to look for, one might believe nothing unusual had happened at all. That's the trouble with water, Japp muttered, watching the surface. It erases, Poirot nodded. Yes, mon ami, but it also reveals when it wishes. Poirot stepped carefully along the planks where Harold Fenwick had been found. The dock workers had resumed their tasks, but they kept a wide berth around the area, as though death left a stain that could seep into their boots. Poirot stopped near a post and crouched. Here, he said softly. Japp leaned in. What is it? Poirot pointed to a faint dark line on the wood, subtle but distinct. A rope mark, Poirot said. A lot of ropes get dragged over docks, Japp said. Poirot smiled faintly. Yes, but not like this. He traced the line with the tip of his finger. It was short, angled, and ended abruptly, as though the rope had been tightened and then lifted rather than pulled away. This, Poirot said, is not casual. It is deliberate. Japp frowned. You think the body was moved with a rope? Poirot did not answer immediately. He rose and walked to the edge, peering down at the waterline. When a man is placed, Poirot said quietly, he is often placed with help. The widow's memory. They left the dock and went to the small cottage where Martha Fenwick had been brought after identifying her husband's belongings. The house smelled faintly of tea and damp wool. A shawl lay draped over the back of a chair. It looked as though it had been thrown there in haste and never adjusted. Martha Fenwick sat rigidly, her hands clenched around a cup she did not drink. Her eyes were dry, too dry, and Poirot recognized the particular restraint of someone who had cried earlier and now had nothing left. Madame Fenwick, Poirot said gently, I am sorry for your loss. She nodded once. He was careful. He never took risks. Poirot inclined his head. That is why we must understand why he was at the dock, she swallowed. He said he had extra work, manifests, shipping notes. Poirot's eyes sharpened. Did he say with whom? She hesitated. No. Poirot waited. Harold didn't like trouble, she added quickly, as if to defend him against an accusation. If there was trouble, he would avoid it. Poirot nodded. And yet trouble found him. Poirot leaned slightly forward. Madame, he said softly, did your husband mention the tide, the schedule? She blinked. The tide? Yes, Martha frowned, thinking. He did keep a little tide chart on the wall for deliveries. But that was for work. Poirot's moustache twitched. A tide chart, he murmured. For a clerk. Japp cleared his throat. Dock work, maybe. Martha shook her head. Harold never went onto the dock at night. He hated the damp. He said it got into your bones. Poirot smiled faintly. Yes, damp is persistent. He stood. Thank you, madame. As they left, Japp muttered, Tide chart doesn't make her husband guilty. Poirot replied softly. No, it makes him prepared. So the watchman, who heard nothing, Samuel Clark, the night watchman, was found in the harbour-master's office, sitting awkwardly as though he expected to be scolded. He was a sturdy man with weathered hands and a face that suggested long nights and short patience. Japp began bluntly. You said you heard nothing. No footsteps, no arguments, nothing. Clark nodded. That's right. Poirot studied him quietly. You were on duty from midnight, Poirot said. Yes. And you walked the dock? Every hour, Poirot nodded. Show me. Clark looked surprised but complied. They returned to the dock. Clark demonstrated his route, past the warehouse doors, along the outer pier, then back toward the lantern post near the stairs. Poirot walked beside him, counting the steps in his mind. He noted where the boards creaked, where they fell silent, where a foot could be placed without complaint. You stop here, Poirot said, indicating the lantern post. Clark nodded. To check the light. Habit, Poirot nodded. Habit is useful. Habit becomes predictable. Clark frowned. Are you saying someone timed me? Poirot did not answer directly. Tell me, Poirot said gently, do you ever leave your route? Clark bristled. No. Japp's eyebrows rose. Never? Not even for tea? Clark's jaw tightened. I'm paid to watch. Poirot's eyes remained kind. Indeed. Poirot turned slightly, facing the edge of the dock. Samuel, Poirot said softly, if someone moved on the dock while you were at the lantern post, Would you see them? Clark hesitated. Depends where, Poirot pointed. There, near the outer pier corner. Clark squinted. Not always. Fog. And that corner sits lower. Poirot nodded. And if someone moved while the tide was low, Poirot continued, would the sound travel the same? Clark frowned. Sound? Poirot smiled faintly. Yes, the dock speaks differently when the water is near and when it is far. Japp stared. You're telling me the tide changes sound? Poirot nodded. Water carries, mud absorbs. At low tide the air is emptier beneath the planks. The dock complains less. Clark looked uneasy. I didn't know that. Poirot inclined his head. But the killer did. The warehouse owner's convenient knowledge. They visited Lydia. Hart's warehouse next. It smelled of tar, rope, and old grain sacks. Lydia Hart greeted them with brisk confidence, as though she expected the law to move around her schedule. I've already said what I know, she said. Poirot smiled politely. Then you can say it again, madame, and we will compare. Lydia's eyes narrowed. Compare? Poirot nodded. Truth is consistent. She folded her arms. Harold Fenwick visited yesterday before dusk. He asked about a crate labeled glassware. I told him it was none of his concern. Poirot's eyes sharpened. Glassware, Lydia hesitated. Imports, fragile goods. Poirot glanced toward the dock door. Madame, Poirot said softly, does your warehouse have access to the dock at night? She shrugged. It's a dock. People come and go. Poirot nodded. But you have a private door. Lydia's posture stiffened. A side door, she admitted. For deliveries? Poirot smiled faintly. And that door, Poirot said, opens close to where Harold Fenwick was found. Lydia's eyes flashed. That proves nothing, Poirot inclined his head. It proves possibility. He turned his gaze toward the ropes hanging from hooks. Madam, Poirot said gently, you handle ropes, knots, loading. Lydia's jaw tightened. Of course, Poirot nodded. Then you understand, Poirot continued softly, how a body might be moved without footsteps. Lydia scoffed. Ridiculous. Poirot did not react. He simply noted, quietly, that Lydia Hart had not asked why he thought a body was moved. She had leapt straight to denial. People deny what they understand. The missing hour. Back at the dock, Poirot asked for the tide schedule. The harbour master brought a worn chart. Low tide was at 5:18 a.m., he said. Then it turned. Poirot nodded. And the body was found at dawn. About 6:05, said Thomas Reed, the labourer. Poirot's eyes narrowed. That is, Poirot said softly, almost 1 hour after low tide. Japp frowned. So? Poirot held up a finger. If the body had been here before low tide, Poirot said, it would have been exposed earlier. Someone would have seen it. Poirot paused. And if it had been placed after dawn, too many eyes were present. Poirot smiled faintly. Therefore, he concluded, the body arrived in the window where the dock is quietest, the water lowest, and the watchman most predictable. Japp exhaled. You're saying between 5:18 and 6:05? Poirot nodded. Yes, he turned to Clark. During that hour, Poirot asked softly, where exactly were you? Clark's face reddened. On my route, Poirot nodded gently. All of it? Clark's eyes flicked away. Japp leaned forward. Answer, Clark swallowed. I stepped off for 5 minutes. Poirot's tone remained calm. Where? Clark muttered. Behind the warehouse corner. For a cigarette. Japp swore under his breath. Poirot did not. He simply nodded. 5 minutes, Poirot said softly, is enough. Poirot's first conclusion. As they walked back along the pier, Poirot spoke quietly to Japp. The killer did not need speed, Poirot said. Japp frowned. What did he need? Poirot replied softly. He needed timing, he needed access, and he needed the tide. Poirot glanced once more toward Lydia Hart's warehouse door. Private, close, useful. And perhaps, Poirot added, he needed a rope. The water lapped gently at the pilings, rising as though it wished to erase everything again. But Poirot's little grey cells had already begun to fix the shape of the crime in place. Footsteps could be washed away, but time could not. Chapter 3. A Man Who Shouldn't Be There. Glassmere Dock had settled into an uneasy rhythm. By the third morning after Harold Fenwick's body had been found, the villagers had begun to speak again, but carefully, selectively. Conversations lowered when strangers approached. Names were mentioned only once, then avoided. The dock itself resumed its daily functions with mechanical obedience, as though repetition might erase memory. Hercule Poirot did not believe in erasure. He returned to the dock shortly after breakfast, walking slowly, allowing the place to reveal itself without pressure. The tide was mid-rise now, water pressing against the pilings with quiet insistence. Crates were stacked and restacked. Ropes were coiled with practiced hands. And yet, something felt misplaced. Poirot paused near the spot where the body had been discovered. "Inspector," Poirot said softly to Japp, who stood a few steps behind him, "there is something here that does not belong." Japp frowned. "We've been over this dock twice." Poirot nodded. "Yes, but we have not yet asked the dock the correct question." The problem of purpose. Poirot gestured toward the water. "Harold Fenwick," Poirot said calmly, "was a clerk." Japp nodded. "Shipping manifests, schedules," Poirot continued. "He was not a sailor, not a dock laborer, not a night worker." Poirot turned slightly. "And yet," he said, "he was here at the most precise, inconvenient hour possible." Japp crossed his arms. "Plenty of people end up where they don't belong." Poirot smiled faintly. "Yes," he said, "but not careful men." Poirot began walking, retracing Fenwick's likely path along the dock. He stopped near the warehouse door owned by Lydia Hart. "Here," Poirot said. "This door," Japp nodded. "Private access." Poirot tilted his head. "Inspector," Poirot said, "what reason would a shipping clerk have to enter a warehouse at dawn?" Japp hesitated. "Paperwork?" Poirot shook his head gently. "Paperwork does not require secrecy," Poirot replied, "nor rope marks." The crate that doesn't fit inside Lydia Hart's warehouse. The air was stale and heavy with the smell of wood and salt. Light filtered through high windows, catching on dust motes that drifted lazily. Poirot walked directly toward a crate near the back wall. "This one," he said quietly. Lydia stiffened. "You've already asked about that." Poirot nodded. "Yes, and now I am answering." He examined the markings carefully. "Glassware," Poirot read aloud. "Fragile." Poirot tapped the side of the crate. The sound was wrong, not hollow enough. "Inspector," Poirot said, "glassware does not absorb sound." Japp raised an eyebrow. "You think it's mislabeled?" Poirot smiled faintly. "I think it is intentionally labeled." Poirot crouched and examined the base of the crate. "There is water staining," Poirot said softly. "Recent," Lydia's voice sharpened. "It rained last night." Poirot nodded. "And yet," Poirot continued, "this stain runs upward, not down." Japp's eyes narrowed. "So it was in water." Poirot nodded. "Briefly." Poirot stood. "This crate," he said calmly, "was at the edge of the dock during low tide." Silence filled the warehouse. The man who wasn't supposed to see Poirot turned suddenly. "Madame Hart," he said gently, "did Harold Fenwick see this crate at the dock?" Lydia hesitated. Poirot did not rush her. "He came with questions," Poirot continued. "And careful men do not ask questions unless they already know something is wrong." Lydia's jaw tightened. "He was nosy," Poirot nodded. "No, he was methodical." Poirot stepped closer. "He checked manifests," Poirot said. "He noticed discrepancies. And then he came here." Poirot's voice lowered. "Harold Fenwick discovered something that should not have been on the dock at dawn." Lydia laughed sharply. "You're inventing motives." Poirot replied calmly. "No, madame, I am reconstructing purpose." The rope tells its story. Poirot asked to see the ropes used near the warehouse. Lydia gestured impatiently. Poirot examined them one by one. "Inspector," Poirot said softly, "look here." Japp leaned in. One rope bore a darker section, slightly stiff, faintly salt-crusted. "This rope," Poirot said, "was recently wet, and then dried. Japp frowned. That's normal at a dock, Poirot nodded. But not at this height, he replied. Poirot held the rope against the dock's edge. At low tide, Poirot explained. This length would reach the seabed. Poirot lowered the rope further. And a body, Poirot said quietly, could be guided upward without lifting. Japp exhaled slowly. You're saying Fenwick was pulled up, Poirot nodded. After he was already dead, Poirot added. And the missing argument, Poirot returned to the dock, standing exactly where Fenwick's body had been found. No signs of struggle, Poirot said. No witnesses. No raised voices. Poirot turned to Japp. Inspector, he said softly. Men argue loudly, unless they are already convinced. Japp frowned. Convinced of what? Poirot replied calmly. That compliance will solve the problem. Poirot gestured toward the water. Fenwick was not attacked, Poirot said. He was persuaded to come. A name that hasn't been asked, Poirot stopped walking. Inspector, he said suddenly, we have discussed everyone who found the body. Japp nodded. But not, Poirot continued, everyone who expected it. Japp's eyes narrowed. You have someone in mind, Poirot nodded. A man, Poirot said, who knew the tide, who knew the watchman's habits, and who had reason to fear a clerk with a ledger. Poirot looked back toward the village. Who handles dock schedules, Poirot said softly, but is not officially responsible for them. Japp inhaled sharply. The harbour master's assistant. Poirot smiled faintly. Yes, he said, Edward Bellamy. The man who arrived too early, Edward Bellamy, was found near the office, already waiting. Too ready. Inspector, Bellamy said nervously, I heard you wanted to see me. Poirot observed him carefully. Bellamy's boots were clean, too clean. Mr. Bellamy, Poirot said gently, where were you between 5 and 6 on the morning Harold Fenwick died? Bellamy swallowed. Here, preparing logs. Poirot nodded. And you did not go onto the dock? Bellamy shook his head. Poirot smiled faintly. Then tell me, Poirot said softly, why your boots are dry, but your cuffs smell faintly of salt. Bellamy's eyes widened. Poirot did not accuse. He merely waited. Poirot's third conclusion. As Bellamy was dismissed for now, Poirot turned to Japp. We have a man, Poirot said, who understands timing, who controls information, and who feared exposure. Poirot paused. But we do not yet have proof. Japp nodded. So what's next? Poirot smiled. Now, he said calmly, we let the tide rise again. Chapter 4. The Dock That Moves. Glassmere Dock had a peculiar habit. It never stayed the same for long. Even on calm days when the wind barely stirred the water and the gulls rested lazily on the posts, the dock shifted. It rose, it fell, it breathed with the tide. To the villagers, this was background rhythm, so familiar it went unnoticed. To Hercule Poirot, it was a language waiting to be translated. He stood at the edge of the planks shortly after midday, watching the water climb inch by inch toward the wood. The tide was returning steadily now, reclaiming the space it had abandoned at dawn. The mud line vanished first, then the lower pilings, until the water lapped once more against the dock, as though nothing unusual had ever occurred. Inspector Japp joined him, notebook tucked under his arm. You've been staring at the water for a long time, Japp remarked. Poirot smiled faintly, because it tells the truth without speaking. Movement without noise. Poirot stepped carefully onto the outer pier. Inspector, he said, when a man walks on a dock, what do we expect? Japp frowned. Noise. Exactly, Poirot replied. Creaking boards? Complaints? Poirot shifted his weight deliberately. The plank beneath his foot groaned softly. But, Poirot continued, sound is not constant. It depends on support. He pointed downward. When the tide is high, water presses against the pilings, Poirot explained. The dock is braced. It resists movement. Poirot waited until a wave rolled in. You hear that? He asked. Japp nodded. Clear as day. Poirot stepped back. At low tide, Poirot continued, the dock is unsupported beneath. Air replaces water. The planks relax. Poirot walked again. This time the sound was barely audible. Japp's eyebrows rose. So footsteps could be quieter, Poirot nodded. Not silent, but selective. Poirot turned toward the lantern post. And if one knows where to step, he added softly, one may pass unnoticed. Edward Bellamy's advantage, Poirot and Japp walked toward the dock office. Edward Bellamy, Poirot said calmly, has worked here for years. Japp nodded. Assistant harbour master, knows schedules, Poirot smiled faintly. He knows tides, Poirot said. He knows watch routes. And he knows which boards complain and which do not, Japp exhaled. You think he moved Fenwick himself? Poirot shook his head gently. Not necessarily alone, Poirot replied, but with knowledge. With a ledger that raises its head. Inside the dock office, Poirot requested access to the shipping ledgers. Bellamy watched nervously as thick books were placed on the desk. Poirot flipped through them, slowly, methodically. Inspector, Poirot said quietly, do you notice something? Japp leaned in. Most of these entries are tidy. Poirot nodded. Yes. Poirot turned a page. And then, he said, there are corrections. Small amendments, dates rewritten, weights adjusted. These changes, Poirot continued, are subtle, legal but frequent. Japp frowned. Smuggling? Poirot shook his head. No, he said. Reclassification. Poirot tapped a particular entry. Glassware, Poirot read aloud. Fragile imports. Poirot's moustache twitched. This term, Poirot said softly, appears when items do not wish to be inspected closely. Japp straightened. You think Fenwick noticed? Poirot nodded. Fenwick was careful, Poirot said. He cross-checked. And when he did, the dock became dangerous. But the hour that could not be denied, Poirot returned to the timeline. The window remains, Poirot said. 5:18 to 6:05. Poirot turned toward Bellamy. During this hour, Poirot asked calmly, you prepared logs? Bellamy nodded stiffly. Poirot smiled faintly. And yet, Poirot said, you signed them later. Bellamy's face paled. That's normal. Poirot inclined his head. Yes, he said, but not that day. Poirot gestured toward the ledger. You accounted for cargo, Poirot continued, while the dock was busiest. Poirot stepped closer. But during the quietest hour, your entries pause. Bellamy swallowed. In the dock demonstrates Poirot made an unusual request. He asked Bellamy, Japp, and 2 dock workers to accompany him to the outer pier. The tide is nearly high, Poirot said. Perfect. Poirot stepped onto the planks and walked deliberately. The dock groaned loudly. Now, Poirot said, stepping back. Wait. Minutes passed. The tide began to fall again, slowly. Poirot waited patiently. After nearly 40 minutes, he stepped forward again. This time the dock barely complained. Japp's eyes widened. Poirot turned to Bellamy. This, Poirot said calmly, is when you moved. Bellamy shook his head frantically. You can't prove that. Poirot nodded. No, he said, but I can prove how. The second rope Poirot returned to the warehouse and requested to see all ropes again. One was missing. Where is this rope? Poirot asked gently. Lydia Hart frowned. Probably taken for repairs. Poirot nodded. And when was it last used? Lydia hesitated. Poirot waited. Early morning, she admitted. Poirot smiled faintly. During low tide, he said softly. Here the truth takes shape back at the dock, Poirot summarized quietly to Japp. Fenwick discovered irregular cargo, Poirot said. He confronted someone he trusted. He was persuaded to come quietly. He was killed elsewhere, likely stunned. And then he was placed, Poirot paused. The dock did the rest. Japp ran a hand through his hair. So the dock moved the crime, Poirot nodded. Yes, he said, and it moved the killer's confidence too. Bellamy's mistake, Poirot, turned back to Edward Bellamy. One question, Poirot said gently. Bellamy's voice shook. What? Poirot smiled. When the tide rose, Poirot asked, "Where did you put the rope?" Bellamy hesitated too long. Poirot nodded. "That," he said softly, "is enough for now." Chapter 5: False Alibis at Sunrise. By the fifth day, Glassmere Dock had learned to lie politely. It did not close, it did not resist, it simply continued. Planks drying in the sun, ropes coiled neatly, ledgers signed with practiced indifference. To an outsider, the place looked settled, almost healed. But Poirot knew better. A location that resumed normality too quickly often did so because everyone had silently agreed on what not to discuss. Sunrise was the most dangerous time for such agreements. Poirot arrived early again, before the fishermen had fully gathered and before the harbour bells announced the working hour. The sky was pale, streaked with thin lines of pink and grey, and the water lay deceptively calm. The tide was neither fully in nor fully out, hovering undecided. "Inspector," Poirot said softly as Japp joined him, "this is the hour when lies prefer to stand." Japp yawned. "Most people lie better when they're tired." Poirot smiled faintly. "And when they believe the night has protected them." At the nature of alibis, Poirot stopped near the lantern post and turned slowly in a circle, taking in the dock. "An alibi," Poirot said thoughtfully, "is not a statement of where one was. It is a statement of confidence." Japp raised an eyebrow. "You saying these people are confident?" Poirot nodded. "They have rehearsed," he said, "and rehearsal creates harmony." Poirot gestured toward the warehouse. "Let us disturb that harmony." Lydia Hart's morning routine. Lydia Hart was already awake when Poirot and Japp arrived at her warehouse. She was supervising the unloading of crates, issuing instructions sharply, her voice crisp and controlled. "Busy morning," Poirot observed pleasantly. "Business doesn't stop for murder," Lydia replied curtly. Poirot nodded. "No, but murder often stops business. Temporarily." Lydia did not smile. Poirot leaned slightly forward. "Madame Hart," he said gently, "please tell me your movements on the morning Harold Fenwick died." Lydia crossed her arms. "I arrived at 6:30, as always." Poirot nodded. "You did not come earlier." "No." Poirot tilted his head. "And yet," he said softly, "your side door was open at 5:40. Lydia stiffened. "Someone must have forgotten to lock it." Poirot smiled faintly. "Indeed," he said. "Someone." Poirot gestured toward the dock. "At that time," Poirot continued, "the dock was nearly empty. The tide was low. The watchman had stepped away." Poirot paused. "A very convenient moment," he added quietly. Lydia snapped. "Are you accusing me?" Poirot raised his hands gently. "No, madame," he said. "I am comparing." The watchman's revised story. Samuel Clark avoided Poirot's eyes when they spoke again. "You said you stepped away for 5 minutes," Poirot said calmly. Clark nodded. "Yes." Poirot waited. "And now," Poirot continued gently, "you say it was closer to 10. Clark swallowed. "Time feels different at night." Poirot smiled kindly. "Yes," he said. "It stretches." Poirot leaned closer. "But 10 minutes," Poirot said softly, "is enough for persuasion and placement." Clark's hands trembled slightly. "I didn't see anything," he insisted. Poirot nodded. "I believe you," he said. Clark looked up sharply. Poirot continued, "Because you were not meant to." The retired Captain Certainty, Captain Rowley, the retired mariner, greeted Poirot with forced cheer. "Terrible business," he said. "Terrible?" Poirot nodded. "Indeed," Rowley puffed on his pipe. "I was asleep," Rowley said. "Turned in early." Poirot smiled faintly. "You sleep lightly?" Poirot asked. "Like a sailor," Rowley replied proudly. Poirot nodded. "And yet," Poirot said softly, "you did not hear the splash." Rowley frowned. "Splash?" Poirot tilted his head. "If a body fell from the dock," Poirot said, "there would be sound." Rowley hesitated. "Perhaps, but waves—" Poirot shook his head gently. "No," he said, "not at low tide." Rowley shifted uncomfortably. Poirot made a note. Edward Bellamy's perfect morning. Edward Bellamy arrived at the dock office just as Poirot was leaving the warehouse. "Inspector," Bellamy said quickly, "I hope I can help." Poirot smiled. "Then help me understand," Poirot said gently, "how you remember that morning so clearly." Bellamy nodded eagerly. "I arrived at 5, he said. "Checked logs, prepared manifests." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "You are very precise." Bellamy smiled nervously. "I like order." Poirot nodded. "And during the crucial window," Poirot continued, "you did not leave the office?" "No." Poirot waited. "And yet," Poirot said softly, "someone signed the ledger in your absence." Bellamy's face drained of color. "That must be a mistake." Poirot smiled faintly. "Mistakes," he said, "cluster around fear." Poirot's quiet reconstruction. That afternoon, Poirot gathered Inspector Japp near the outer pier. "Observe," Poirot said quietly. He gestured as dock workers moved crates. "Everyone agrees on the same story," Poirot said. "They did not see, they did not hear, they were elsewhere." Poirot paused. "But no one," he added, "agrees on why." Japp frowned. "So what's the lie?" Poirot smiled faintly. "The lie," he said softly, "is that Harold Fenwick arrived here alone." "Truth about sunrise," Poirot explained calmly. "At sunrise," he said, "people believe night excuses them." Poirot gestured toward the water. "But the tide does not excuse," he continued. "It records." Poirot looked toward the warehouse, the office, the lantern post. "Fenwick was summoned," Poirot said. "He came expecting explanation. He encountered resistance, and someone else arrived to ensure silence." Japp nodded slowly. "You think Bellamy arranged it?" Poirot replied softly, "I think Bellamy organized it." The alibi that slips Poirot returned once more to Lydia Hart. "One last question," Poirot said gently. She exhaled sharply. "What now?" Poirot smiled. "At sunrise," Poirot asked, "did you hear the bell?" Lydia frowned. "Which bell?" Poirot nodded. "That," he said softly, "is precisely the problem. The harbour bell had rung at 6. Everyone else remembered it. Lydia had not, because she had been inside the warehouse with the dock door open, listening for footsteps instead." Poirot's fifth conclusion. As the sun rose fully, Poirot stood still and allowed the dock to settle around him. "We now know," Poirot said quietly to Japp, "that the alibis agree because they were adjusted." Poirot paused. "But someone," he added, "forgot to adjust one detail." Japp leaned forward. "Which one?" Poirot smiled faintly. "The bell," he said. "And bells," Poirot concluded softly, "are very difficult to silence." Chapter 6. The rope that was retied. By the 6th morning, Glassmere Dock had grown defensive. It was not fear exactly. Fear had burned itself out during the first days after Harold Fenwick's body was discovered. What remained now was something more stubborn: habit. People returned to their tasks with the grim determination of those who hoped that repetition might dull memory. Nets were mended, crates were shifted, ledgers were signed. The bell rang on schedule. And yet every sound seemed louder than before. Hercule Poirot noticed this immediately. He stood near the outer pier, listening not just to the dock but to the people who moved upon it. Their steps were careful now, not cautious but considered. Each person appeared faintly aware of how noise might be interpreted. "When people begin to monitor themselves," Poirot murmured to Inspector Japp, "it means they are afraid of being heard." Japp folded his arms. "You think someone's still trying to control the dock?" Poirot nodded. "Control rarely ends with the act itself. It lingers." The rope that should have been forgotten. Poirot's attention returned once again to the ropes. They hung in their usual places, coiled, looped, draped over hooks, worn smooth by years of use. To an untrained eye, they were indistinguishable from one another. To Poirot, they were individual histories waiting to be read. He reached for one particular rope near Lydia Hart's warehouse door. "This," Poirot said softly, "has changed." Japp frowned. "Looks the same to me." Poirot lifted the coil and let part of it fall loosely to the planks. "Observe," Poirot said. The rope settled awkwardly, refusing to lie flat. It has been retied, Poirot explained. Recently? Japp leaned closer. So? Poirot smiled faintly. A rope, Poirot said, is like handwriting. Once learned, it resists change. He knelt and examined the knot carefully. This knot, Poirot continued, is competent but unfamiliar. Japp's eyes narrowed. Meaning whoever tied it isn't the usual hand, Poirot nodded. Exactly. Why retie a rope? Poirot straightened and gazed toward the waterline. Inspector, he said gently, if one uses a rope to move a body, what remains? Japp grimaced. Marks, wear, salt, Poirot nodded. And if one wishes to remove suspicion? Poirot continued. What does one do? Japp exhaled. Recoil it. Make it look ordinary. Poirot smiled faintly. Yes, he said. But one forgets something. Poirot held up the rope again. Memory, he said softly. Ropes remember how they were used. The warehouse door at dawn. Poirot asked Lydia Hart to join them. She arrived briskly, her expression carefully neutral. You've been handling this rope? Poirot asked calmly. Lydia frowned. It's dock equipment. Anyone can. Poirot nodded. And when was it last used? Poirot continued. She hesitated. I couldn't say. Poirot waited. Early morning, she admitted, for moving crates. Poirot inclined his head. Which crates? He asked. Lydia snapped. I don't catalogue every movement. Poirot smiled gently. No, he said. But someone did. Poirot gestured toward the dock office. The ledger speaks again. Inside the office, Poirot reopened the shipping logs. Edward Bellamy stood nearby, too attentive. Poirot traced a finger down the page. Crate relocation, Poirot read. 5:42 a.m. Bellamy swallowed. Routine, Poirot nodded. And yet, Poirot said softly, the crate was returned by 5:55. Bellamy's lips parted slightly. 13 minutes, Poirot said quietly. Enough to move something heavy, and then correct the evidence. Japp leaned forward. You logged the movement? Bellamy nodded stiffly. Yes, Poirot smiled faintly. Then you know, Poirot said, exactly which rope was used. Bellamy said nothing. The retie that betrayed him. Poirot returned to the dock with Bellamy and Japp. Please, Poirot said politely, show me how you would normally coil this rope. Bellamy hesitated, then complied. He worked quickly, efficiently, but not quite. Correctly, Poirot observed without comment. When Bellamy finished, Poirot gently adjusted the coil. You see, Poirot said calmly, this rope has been taught to lie another way. Poirot looked up. And someone, he continued softly, forgot that it would remember. Bellamy's face had gone pale. And the silent interval. Poirot reconstructed the moment aloud, not accusing, teaching. Between 5:18 and 6:05, Poirot said, the dock was quiet. The tide was low. The watchman was absent. Poirot gestured toward the warehouse. A crate was moved. A rope was lowered. A body already lifeless was guided upward. Poirot paused. And then, he added, everything was returned. Japp nodded slowly. Including the rope, Poirot smiled faintly. Yes, but not its memory. Bellamy's control slips. Bellamy spoke suddenly. You're building a story, he snapped. That's all. Poirot looked at him kindly. No, Poirot said softly. I am dismantling one. Poirot stepped closer. You did not strike Harold Fenwick, Poirot said, but you arranged his silence. Bellamy's jaw tightened. You can't prove that, Poirot nodded. Not yet, he said, but you will help me. Bellamy laughed bitterly. How? Poirot replied calmly. By trying to correct one last detail. The rope test. Poirot requested that all dock ropes be temporarily removed for inspection. Bellamy reacted instantly. That will disrupt operations, he said sharply. Poirot smiled. Yes, he said, that is the point. Bellamy's confidence wavered. Poirot continued gently. Only one person here knows which rope cannot be replaced easily. Bellamy said nothing, but his eyes flicked briefly, involuntarily, toward the warehouse hook. Poirot nodded. "That," he said softly, "is the rope." Poirot's sixth conclusion. As the ropes were gathered, Poirot spoke quietly to Japp. "We are close," Poirot said. "Bellamy is not a violent man. He is an organizing man." Poirot paused. "He did not kill Harold Fenwick in anger," Poirot said. "He killed him in correction." Japp exhaled slowly. "And the others?" Poirot replied softly. "They cooperated," he said, "because routine is easier than courage." The tide returns again. Later that afternoon, Poirot stood alone on the dock. The tide was rising once more. The water erased nothing this time. It merely reflected. Poirot watched his reflection distort gently. "The sea," he murmured, "never hides the truth. It only delays it." Chapter 7, Poirot recreates the night. Glassmere Dock had never hosted an audience before. It was not a place designed for gatherings or speeches. It existed for function, arrival, departure, loading, unloading. Voices were usually practical here, clipped by wind and routine. But on this evening, as the light thinned and the tide prepared once more to turn, people gathered not to work, but to remember. Hercule Poirot stood near the lantern post, hands clasped behind his back, his posture calm and deliberate. Inspector Japp positioned himself slightly to one side, notebook tucked away. This was not an interview. It was a demonstration. Edward Bellamy arrived early. That detail did not escape Poirot. Bellamy stood close to the dock office, eyes moving constantly toward the water, the warehouse door, the watchman's route. He wore composure like a coat that was slightly too tight. Lydia Hart arrived next, arms folded, lips pressed thin. Captain Rowley leaned on his cane, pretending indifference. Samuel Clark, the night watchman, hovered awkwardly near the edge of the group, his cap twisted nervously in his hands. A few dock workers stood farther back, curious and uneasy. Poirot waited until the tide reached its midpoint. Then he spoke. "Why reconstruction matters. Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began gently, "I thank you for coming." No one replied. Poirot smiled faintly. "We are not here to accuse," he continued. "We are here to observe." Bellamy shifted his weight. Poirot gestured toward the dock beneath their feet. "This place," Poirot said, "changes its behavior depending on the hour, the tide, and the attention paid to it." Poirot paused. "On the night Harold Fenwick died," he said softly, "Glassmere Dock behaved very differently from how you know it now." He turned toward Samuel Clark. "Monsieur Clark," Poirot said kindly, "you were on duty." Clark nodded stiffly. "You walked your route," Poirot continued, "as you always do." "Yes," Clark said quickly. Poirot nodded. "And yet," Poirot added, "you did not hear the dock complain." Clark swallowed. Watchman's position. Poirot walked slowly to the lantern post. "Please," he said gently, "stand where you stood that night." Clark hesitated, then moved into position. Poirot turned to the others. "At this point," Poirot said, "the watchman checks the lantern. His back is turned, his attention is fixed." Poirot stepped away and gestured toward the outer pier. "And here," Poirot continued, "is where something important happened." Poirot waited. Then he spoke quietly. "Mr. Bellamy," he said, "please stand where you were at 5:35 a.m. Bellamy stiffened. "I was in the office." Poirot nodded. "Yes," Poirot gestured. "Stand there." Bellamy hesitated only a second before complying. Poirot smiled faintly. The dock demonstrates again. Poirot raised a hand. "Now," he said softly, "let us listen." He stepped deliberately onto the planks near the warehouse door. The dock groaned faintly. Poirot nodded. "That is how it sounds now," Poirot said. Mid-tide. Poirot waited. Minutes passed. The water shifted lower. Poirot stepped again. This time, the sound was barely noticeable. A murmur passed through the onlookers. "You see," Poirot said calmly, "the dock does not always announce movement." Poirot looked directly at Bellamy. "It cooperates," he added, when asked correctly. Bellamy's jaw tightened. The warehouse door. Poirot turned toward Lydia Hart. "Madam," he said gently, "your warehouse door opens directly onto the dock." "Yes," Lydia replied curtly. Poirot nodded. "And at dawn," Poirot continued, "that door was open." Lydia shrugged. "For work?" Poirot inclined his head. "Then let us use it." Poirot opened the door. The hinges barely whispered. Poirot smiled faintly. "A well-oiled hinge," he said, "maintained carefully." He turned to the group. "Someone ensured," Poirot said, "that silence would not be broken." Lydia looked away. At the movement of the body, Poirot walked to the edge of the dock. "At low tide," he said, "the water retreats." He gestured downward. "A body placed here," Poirot continued, "would not float, it would wait." Poirot paused. "But if a body is already in the water," he added softly, "it can be guided." Poirot turned. "With a rope." A ripple of discomfort moved through the group. Poirot looked directly at Bellamy. "You did not carry Harold Fenwick," Poirot said. "You did not drag him." Poirot gestured toward the rope hook. "You guided him." Bellamy laughed sharply. "You're making this up." Poirot smiled. "No," he said. "I am simplifying." At the timing that cannot be denied, Poirot raised his hand again. "Inspector," he said, "what time is it?" Japp checked his watch. "Just after 6. Poirot nodded. "The bell?" Poirot said. The harbour bell rang, clear, resonant. Poirot looked at Lydia Hart. "You did not remember this bell," Poirot said gently. Lydia stiffened. "Because at that moment," Poirot continued, "you were listening for footsteps." Poirot turned to Captain Rowley. "And you," Poirot said, "did not hear a splash." Rowley shifted uncomfortably. "Because," Poirot continued, "there was none." Poirot turned slowly, encompassing them all. "Harold Fenwick was not thrown into the water," Poirot said calmly. "He was placed." The crate's final purpose. Poirot moved back toward the warehouse. "That crate labeled glassware," Poirot said softly, "served one purpose." He paused. "It blocked sightlines," Poirot gestured. "Placed here," he continued, "it prevents the watchman from seeing movement." Poirot nodded toward Clark. "You did not see," Poirot said kindly, "because you were not meant to." Clark looked sick. Pressure without accusation. Poirot returned to the lantern post. "I will not accuse anyone tonight," Poirot said calmly. Bellamy looked almost relieved. Poirot continued. "I will simply ask one thing." Poirot turned to Bellamy. "Mr. Bellamy," he said softly, "if the rope inspection continues tomorrow." Bellamy's eyes flicked involuntarily toward the warehouse. Poirot smiled faintly. What will you do?" Bellamy said nothing, but silence this time did not protect him. Poirot's seventh conclusion. Poirot turned to Inspector Japp. "We have shown," Poirot said quietly, "how it was done, why it was done, and who controlled the night." Poirot paused. "What remains," he added, "is confession or collapse." Japp nodded grimly. The dock. After the crowd, as the group dispersed, Poirot remained alone. The tide rose steadily. The dock returned to its complaints. Poirot smiled faintly. "When a place is forced to repeat the truth," he murmured, "it becomes impossible to deny." The night had been recreated, and someone had not survived the memory. Chapter 8. The tide turns against the killer. The night after the reconstruction did not bring sleep to Glassmere. Lights burned longer than usual in cottages overlooking the harbour. Curtains shifted. Footsteps sounded on gravel paths at hours when no one normally walked. The dock itself lay half submerged, the tide high enough now to cover the secrets it had revealed only hours earlier. But secrets, Poirot knew, did not dissolve in water. They float. Hercule Poirot stood at the window of the small guest room lent to him by the harbour master. From there he could see the faint outline of the dock lanterns reflected in the water, elongated, wavering, distorted by movement beneath the surface. "Movement," Poirot murmured to himself, "always betrays intention." Inspector Japp arrived shortly after midnight, hat in hand, expression grim. You were right, Japp said quietly. Someone's unsettled. Poirot turned calmly. Only one person needed to be. The first crack Edward Bellamy had made his mistake before dawn. It was a small one, so small that only someone expecting it would notice. But Poirot had been expecting precisely this kind of error. At 4:47 a.m., Bellamy entered the dock office. He should not have been there. The office log showed no scheduled work until 6, no deliveries, no inspections, no reason for an assistant harbour master to arrive while the tide was still high and the dock largely deserted. And yet, the office door had been unlocked. Poirot examined the logbook later that morning with quiet satisfaction. "Inspector," Poirot said softly, "when a man returns to the scene of a crime, it is never to admire his work." Japp nodded. "You think he was fixing something?" Poirot smiled faintly. "No," he replied. "I think he was checking." Why the killer returns, Poirot and Japp walked slowly along the dock as the morning fog thinned. "Bellamy believes," Poirot said, "that the dock can be controlled like a ledger." Japp frowned. "Meaning?" Poirot gestured toward the water. "He thinks timing solves everything," Poirot continued. "Correct the hour, correct the rope, correct the alibi." Poirot paused. "But he forgets," Poirot added softly, "that people react when pressure is reapplied." Japp exhaled. "So he went back to make sure nothing changed." Poirot nodded. "And in doing so," Poirot said, "he changed something himself." But the rope that should not have moved, they found it near the warehouse door. The rope, the same rope Poirot had identified earlier, had been shifted slightly from its hook, not dramatically, just enough to suggest it had been handled, tested, then replaced in haste. Poirot crouched beside it. "This rope," he said quietly, "was not needed this morning." Japp frowned. "So why touch it?" Poirot replied softly. "Because Bellamy could not tolerate uncertainty." Poirot lifted the rope and examined the knot. It had been adjusted, not retied entirely, just tightened. "A nervous correction," Poirot murmured. Lydia Hart's final cooperation. Poirot requested a private conversation with Lydia Hart. She did not resist this time. They met inside the warehouse, the air heavy with dust and old salt. "I don't know what you want from me anymore," Lydia said sharply. Poirot looked at her kindly. "I want you," he said gently, "to stop protecting a man who will not protect you." Lydia laughed bitterly. "Bellamy promised this would end." Poirot nodded. "And when promises fail," Poirot said softly, "fear begins to improvise." Lydia looked away. "He came early," she admitted. "Before dawn." Poirot inclined his head. "And he checked the rope," Poirot continued. "Yes." Poirot waited. "And then?" he asked gently. Lydia swallowed. "He asked if anyone had been near the crate." Poirot nodded slowly. "That," he said, "is concern, not routine." The fatal question. Poirot returned to Bellamy later that morning. Bellamy was waiting this time, too composed, too eager. "You wanted to see me?" Bellamy asked. Poirot smiled pleasantly. "Yes," he said. "I have one question." Bellamy nodded. "Of course." Poirot leaned slightly forward. "Mr. Bellamy," he said softly, "why did you adjust the rope this morning?" Bellamy froze. What rope?" Poirot smiled faintly. "The one you should not remember touching," Poirot replied. Bellamy laughed nervously. "You're imagining things." Poirot nodded. "Then answer me this," Poirot said calmly. "Why did you unlock the office at 4:47? Bellamy's mouth opened, then closed. Poirot waited. "The tide betrays him." Poirot turned toward the window. "The tide," Poirot said softly, "was still high at that hour." Poirot looked back at Bellamy. "There was nothing for you to do on the dock," Poirot continued, "unless you were worried about something left behind." Bellamy snapped. "You have no proof." Poirot nodded. "Not yet," he said. "But you are providing it." Bellamy's breathing quickened. The missing object. Poirot gestured toward the ledger. "One item," Poirot said, is no longer where it should be. Bellamy frowned. Which item? Poirot smiled faintly. The crate labeled glassware, he said. Bellamy stiffened. Poirot continued. You moved it, Poirot said calmly. After the reconstruction. Bellamy shook his head. No. Poirot raised an eyebrow. And yet, he said, its position has changed, just enough to restore the old sightline. Bellamy's eyes flicked involuntarily toward the dock. Poirot nodded. That, he said softly, is the instinct of a man who wants the night back. Pressure becomes panic. Inspector Japp stepped forward. Edward Bellamy, he said firmly, I'm placing you under formal observation. Bellamy laughed sharply. For what? Being careful? Poirot replied gently. For being afraid. Bellamy's composure finally fractured. You don't understand, Bellamy snapped. Fenwick would have ruined everything. Poirot's voice remained calm. He would have exposed irregularities, Poirot said. That is not ruin, that is correction. Bellamy's shoulders sagged slightly. The killer's real mistake, Poirot spoke softly now. You did not kill Harold Fenwick in anger, Poirot said. You killed him because you believed order justified silence. Bellamy shook his head. I never meant, Poirot raised a hand. You meant to resolve, Poirot said. And when the dock spoke too loudly, you tried to quiet it again. Bellamy whispered. I thought if I fixed it. Poirot nodded. That, he said, is why killers return. Poirot sets the final trap. Poirot turned to Inspector Japp. Tomorrow, Poirot said calmly, we gather everyone again. Japp nodded. Another reconstruction? Poirot smiled faintly. No, he said. A conclusion? Poirot turned back to Bellamy. And you, Poirot added softly, will make a choice. Bellamy said nothing, but the tide outside began to fall, and for the first time it felt deliberate. Chapter 9. The truth floats up. Morning arrived at Glassmere Dock with an honesty that surprised everyone. There was no fog this time, no theatrical mist to soften edges or blur responsibility. The sky was a pale, open blue, and the water lay calm, reflecting the dock's posts with uncomfortable clarity. For the first time since Harold Fenwick's death, nothing was hidden by weather or shadow. It was exactly how Hercule Poirot wanted it. He stood near the lantern post once more, the same place from which he had orchestrated the reconstruction. Inspector Japp waited beside him, watchful but silent. One by one, the others arrived, summoned politely, firmly, with no explanation beyond Poirot's request that their presence was required. Edward Bellamy came last. He looked exhausted, not sleepless in the ordinary sense, but worn down by vigilance, the particular fatigue of someone who has spent too long correcting small details, terrified that one oversight would undo everything. Poirot noticed that Bellamy avoided looking at the water. Why the morning matters. Mesdames et messieurs, Poirot began calmly, once everyone had gathered. Thank you for coming again. A murmur of discomfort passed through the group. Lydia Hart folded her arms. Captain Rowley leaned heavily on his cane. Samuel Clark stared at his boots. The dock workers stood farther back, uncertain whether they were witnesses or spectators. Poirot smiled faintly. This morning, he continued, is important. He gestured toward the water. Because at this hour the tide neither conceals nor reveals, Poirot said. It simply is. Poirot turned slowly, letting his gaze pass over each face. And so, he added softly, must the truth be. At the final reconstruction, Poirot did not begin with accusation. He began with sequence. On the morning Harold Fenwick was found, Poirot said, the tide was low. He paused, allowing the familiar fact to settle. At that moment, Poirot continued, the dock was quiet. The watchman had stepped away. The village was still asleep. Poirot gestured toward Samuel Clark. You did not hear footsteps, Poirot said gently, because the dock was unsupported beneath. Clark nodded weakly. Poirot turned to the warehouse. The side door was open, Poirot said, not accidentally, deliberately. Lydia Hart's lips tightened. Poirot continued. A crate labeled glassware was positioned to block the watchman's view, Poirot said calmly. Not for storage, but for concealment. Poirot paused again. And a rope, he said softly, was lowered. The sound of water lapping against the piling seemed suddenly loud. And the body that was never thrown, Poirot stepped to the edge of the dock. Harold Fenwick did not fall from here, Poirot said. There was no splash, no cry, no struggle. He turned back toward the group. He was already dead, or dying, when he entered the water, Poirot continued. Likely struck elsewhere, where sound would not carry. Poirot's voice remained gentle. He was guided upward, Poirot said, placed carefully, and left to be found when the tide withdrew. Poirot looked directly at Edward Bellamy. Because timing, Poirot said softly, was your ally. Bellamy's jaw tightened. No, the reason Fenwick had to die. Poirot reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded paper. This, Poirot said, is a copy of the shipping manifest Harold Fenwick reviewed the evening before his death. Poirot unfolded it carefully. Several entries are marked for reclassification, Poirot said. Items listed as glassware, fragile, unremarkable. Poirot looked up. But Harold Fenwick noticed discrepancies, he continued. Weights that did not match, delivery times that avoided inspection. Poirot's gaze returned to Bellamy. He came to you, Poirot said calmly, because you controlled dock schedules. Bellamy's voice cracked. He was mistaken. Poirot shook his head gently. No, he said. He was thorough. Poirot stepped closer. And that, Poirot added softly, made him dangerous. The killer's instinct to correct Poirot did not raise his voice. You did not panic, Poirot said to Bellamy. You calculated. Poirot gestured toward the dock. You chose a moment when the dock would cooperate, Poirot continued. You chose a method that required no witnesses, and afterward you corrected every trace you could find. Poirot paused. But correction, he added, is never complete. Bellamy laughed suddenly, a short, brittle sound. You have theories, Bellamy said hoarsely. Nothing more. Poirot nodded. Then allow me, he said calmly, to finish. The mistake that sealed it. Poirot turned to Inspector Japp. Inspector, he said, what time did Mr. Bellamy unlock the office yesterday morning? Japp checked his notes. 4:47 a.m. Poirot nodded. At that hour, Poirot said to the group, the tide was still high. Poirot turned back to Bellamy. There was no reason for you to be here, Poirot said softly. No work, no deliveries, no inspections. Poirot let the silence stretch. You returned, Poirot continued, because you feared something had changed. Bellamy snapped. I was checking my logs. Poirot nodded, and in doing so he replied, You touched the rope. Poirot gestured toward the hook near the warehouse door. You adjusted it, Poirot said. Tightened the knot. Poirot's eyes were kind but unyielding. That rope, he said softly, should have been forgotten. Bellamy's shoulders sagged. Lydia Hart breaks. Lydia spoke suddenly. He came to me, she said sharply. Before dawn. All eyes turned to her. He asked if anyone had been near the crate, she continued. He told me it was just precaution. Poirot nodded gently. But precautions, Poirot said, belong to those who expect consequences. Lydia's voice dropped. I didn't know he was dead already. Poirot inclined his head. But you knew, he said softly, that something was wrong. With a confession that cannot be avoided, Poirot turned back to Bellamy. You see, Poirot said calmly, the dock has already judged you. Bellamy looked around wildly. The tide recorded your timing, Poirot continued. The rope remembered your hand. And fear brought you back when you should have stayed away? Bellamy's breath came fast. I didn't mean to kill him, he whispered. I only wanted him quiet, just long enough to fix the entries. Poirot nodded. But silence, Poirot said gently, is not reversible. Bellamy's voice broke. He wouldn't listen, Bellamy said. He kept asking questions. Poirot replied softly. That, he said, was his duty. Bellamy closed his eyes. Yes, he said quietly. I did it. A collective exhale moved through the group. Shock, relief, sorrow intertwined. Inspector Japp stepped forward. "Edward Bellamy," he said firmly, "you are under arrest for the murder of Harold Fenwick." Bellamy did not resist. What remains after truth? As Bellamy was led away, the dock felt strangely lighter, not relieved, but resolved. Samuel Clark wiped his face with his sleeve. Captain Rowley stared out at the water. Lydia Hart stood very still, her defenses finally lowered. Poirot remained where he was, watching the tide begin its slow retreat. Poirot's ninth conclusion, Inspector Japp joined him. "Well," Japp said quietly, "that's it." Poirot nodded. "Yes," he replied. "The truth has floated up." Poirot looked once more at the dock. "Places," he said softly, "do not commit crimes." Japp waited. "People," Poirot finished, "use places they believe will obey them." Chapter 10. When the water settles, Glassmere Dock did not change overnight. That, Hercule Poirot reflected, was perhaps the most honest thing about it. In the days following Edward Bellamy's arrest, the dock resumed its routines with quiet determination. Boats came and went, crates were lifted, stacked, recorded. The harbour bell rang as it always had, marking hours that now felt heavier with meaning. To an untrained eye, it might have seemed that nothing had altered at all, but Poirot knew better. Places that have witnessed truth do not forget it simply because people wish them to. He stood at the edge of the pier late one afternoon, watching the tide settle into its familiar rhythm. The water was calm, almost courteous, brushing the pilings with gentle insistence. Gulls cried overhead, indifferent to human tragedy, and somewhere behind him, voices carried faintly, work resumed, life continuing. Yet the dock no longer felt complicit. After the confession, Inspector Japp joined Poirot, hands in his coat pockets. "Bellamy's been transferred," Japp said quietly. "He finally stopped talking." Poirot nodded. "Yes, there is a moment when explanation exhausts itself." Japp leaned against a post. "He keeps saying the same thing. He only wanted time. Time to correct the books. Time to fix the problem." Poirot smiled faintly, without humor. "Men who worship order," Poirot said softly, "believe time is something they can rearrange." Japp glanced toward the water. "And the others?" Poirot exhaled slowly. "They will live," he said, "but not unchanged." Lydia Hart's silence. Lydia Hart did not leave Glassmere. Poirot encountered her one morning inside the warehouse, where she supervised work with less sharpness than before. Her movements were slower now, more deliberate, as though she were relearning the rhythm of her own space. "You were right," she said abruptly without looking at him. Poirot inclined his head. "About what, madame?" "About protection," Lydia replied. "Bellamy protected nothing. He only spread the damage." Poirot nodded gently. "You were not his accomplice," Poirot said. "You were his convenience." She laughed bitterly. "That feels worse." Poirot regarded her kindly. "Guilt," he said softly, "is the price of recognizing courage too late." Lydia fell silent, absorbing this. "I won't let the dock be used that way again," she said finally. Poirot smiled faintly. "That," he replied, "is how places heal." The watchman learns to listen. Samuel Clark requested to speak with Poirot before his departure. They met near the lantern post, where the watchman now paused longer than necessary, listening, truly listening. "I should have heard something," Clark said quietly. Poirot shook his head. "You heard exactly what you were meant to hear," he said gently. "Nothing." Clark swallowed. "I trusted routine." Poirot nodded. "Routine," he said, "is only safe when it is questioned." Clark straightened. "I won't step away again," Poirot smiled kindly. "No," he said, "you will step away, but knowingly." A widow's closure. Martha Fenwick received Poirot in her small sitting room, sunlight filtering through thin curtains. Harold Fenwick's ledger lay neatly stacked on a shelf now, no longer a symbol of danger, but of quiet integrity. "He died doing his job," she said softly. Poirot inclined his head. Yes, she hesitated. Was he afraid? Poirot considered this carefully. No, he said at last. He was convinced. She nodded, tears finally falling. That matters, she whispered. Poirot rose to leave. Your husband, Poirot said gently, believed truth was worth inconvenience. Martha pressed her lips together. I will too, she said. The dock without secrecy. On his final evening at Glassmere, Poirot walked the dock alone. The tide was low again, exposing the seabed just as it had on the morning Harold Fenwick's body was discovered. But this time, the exposure felt different, less accusatory, more natural. Poirot knelt briefly near the spot where the body had been found. There is a difference, he murmured, between concealment and patience. The dock no longer waited to be used. It simply existed. Poirot's reflection. As Poirot prepared to leave the following morning, Inspector Japp accompanied him to the car. Funny thing, Japp said, about this case. Poirot raised an eyebrow. The murder was clever, Japp continued, but what broke it wasn't brilliance, it was repetition. Poirot smiled. Yes, he said, the killer returned. Japp nodded. Couldn't leave it alone. Poirot looked back once more at Glassmere Dock. That, he said softly, is the signature of all crimes built on control. What the tide taught, the car rolled slowly away from the harbour road, the dock receding into distance. Poirot watched until it was no longer visible. The tide, Poirot reflected, does not judge, it does not accuse, it merely arrives and leaves. He folded his hands neatly. And in doing so, he added quietly, it reveals what cannot endure exposure. Harold Fenwick's death had not been dramatic. It had been precise, calculated, convenient, and therefore inevitable in its unraveling. Final thought. Poirot closed his eyes briefly as the countryside passed. Crimes, he mused, are not solved by force. They are solved by patience, by listening, by understanding which silences are natural and which are manufactured. Glassmere Dock would remember this lesson. So would those who worked upon it, and Poirot, as always, carried the understanding with him to the next quiet place where truth waited beneath the surface. End of story. Thank you for staying with us until the final tide of this mystery. If you enjoyed this slow-burn Hercule Poirot investigation, share your thoughts in the comments. Was the tide the true witness, or was routine the real accomplice? Remember to like the video and subscribe for more long-form detective mysteries inspired by classic storytelling. Until our next case, keep listening because silence always speaks.